The floodwater rose faster than Sarah had ever imagined possible, swallowing her century-old barn in minutes. But as she watched her 3 rescued horses, animals that had never seen water deeper than a puddle, begin to move toward the submerged structure with an almost mystical calm, she realized this wasn't just a disaster. It was something her grandfather had whispered about in his final days. Something about the old barn's secret, and why the horses always seemed to know things humans couldn't understand. The first crack of thunder split the August sky at 3:47 a.m., and Sarah McKinnon bolted upright in her bed, immediately knowing something was wrong. Not just the storm, she'd weathered plenty of those in her 32 years on the family farm, but something deeper, more primal. The horses were silent. She grabbed her rein slicker and boots, muscle memory guiding her through the darkness of the farmhouse her great-grandfather had built in 1889. Outside, the rain wasn't falling so much as attacking, each drop hitting the ground with the force of a bullet. The pasture lights cast eerie yellow cones through the downpour, and Sarah could barely make out the dark silhouettes of Thunder, Misty, and Dakota standing motionless near the fence line. "Easy, guys," she called out, her voice lost in the storm's roar. But they didn't move toward her voice like they usually did. Instead, all 3 horses had their heads turned toward the old red barn, ears pricked forward in that way that meant they were hearing something. She-couldn. Single quotes T. Sarah had inherited the farm 6 months ago when her grandfather died, along with the 3 rescue horses he'd saved from a slaughter auction just before his stroke. She'd grown up here, spent every summer mucking stalls and learning to ride, but she'd never seen the animals act like this. It was as if they were waiting for something. The rain intensified, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that the creek, running along the eastern edge of her property, was no longer contained within its banks. Dark water was spreading across the lower pasture, moving faster than seemed possible. She'd lived through floods before, but nothing like this. Shit, 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 she muttered, splashing through ankle-deep water toward the barn. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind from that last coherent conversation they'd had. That barn's seen things. Sarah girl, built it where the old swimming hole used to be, before the creek changed course. Sometimes the water remembers. At the time, she'd dismissed it as the rambling of a dying man. Now, watching the floodwater race across her land with unnatural speed, she wondered if he'd been trying to warn her about something. The barn sat on slightly higher ground. But even as Sarah reached it, she could see water lapping at the foundation. Inside, her few head of cattle lowed nervously in their stalls. She'd need to move them to higher ground, and fast. "Come on, girls," she coaxed, opening the first stall. The Holstein heifer hesitated, then followed Sarah's guidance toward the back door and the hill beyond. One by one, she evacuated the cattle, her heart pounding as the water continued to rise. By the time she'd moved the last cow, the barn floor was underwater. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching in fascination and horror as the ancient structure began to fill like a swimming pool. The water was surprisingly clear, and she could see straight down to the wooden floor beneath. Stranger still, the building seemed to be holding the water in rather than letting it flow through. The gaps in the old boards, the spaces around the doors, none of them were letting water escape. "What the hell?" she breathed. A sound behind her made her turn. The 3 horses had broken through the fence, something that should have been impossible, given that Thunder was elderly and Misty had been severely abused before rescue. Were walking calmly through the floodwater toward the barn, not panicking, not struggling against the current, but moving with purpose. "No, no, no," Sarah called out, splashing toward them. "Get back, get to high ground." But Thunder, the ancient gelding who usually moved with arthritic stiffness, was suddenly fluid and graceful in the water. Misty, who normally shied away from anything unfamiliar, followed without hesitation. Dakota, the youngest at 15, but still cautious by nature, brought up the rear with an expression Sarah had never seen before, something almost like recognition. "This is insane," Sarah muttered, but she found herself following them instead of trying to turn them back. The water was now waist-deep and still rising, but somehow she wasn't afraid. The current that should have been dangerous felt gentle, almost supportive. As they reached the barn, Sarah gasped. The structure was now completely flooded, the water level reaching nearly to the hayloft, but instead of the murky, debris-filled flood she expected, the water inside was crystal clear, almost luminous in the storm's strange light. Thunder entered first, and Sarah watched in amazement as the old horse began to swim. Not the panicked thrashing she would have expected from an animal encountering deep water for the first time, but smooth, confident strokes. Misty followed, her movements equally graceful, and then Dakota. They weren't just swimming, they were playing. Thunder actually whinnied with what sounded like joy as he dove beneath the surface, something Sarah would have sworn was impossible for a horse. When he came up, shaking water from his mane, he looked 20 years younger. "Grandpa," Sarah whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. "What did you know?" She climbed onto the fence rail, now partially submerged, and watched her horses transform before her eyes. In the water, their injuries and age seemed to melt away. Thunder's stiff joints moved freely. Misty's scarred hide gleamed in the strange light. Dakota, who had always been timid and withdrawn, was actively playing, splashing and diving like a dolphin. The storm was getting worse, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave. This was impossible, but it was happening. Her horses were swimming in her flooded barn like they'd been doing it their whole lives. And the water god? The water was beautiful. Despite the chaos of the storm, despite the destruction she could see across her property, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced since her grandfather's death. A movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A figure was walking through the flood toward the barn, moving against the current with impossible ease. Sarah's heart stopped as she recognized the silhouette. "Grandpa," she called out, her voice barely audible over the storm. The figure raised a hand in greeting, and Sarah saw his familiar weathered face illuminated by a flash of lightning. He looked exactly as he had in his prime, before the stroke, before the years of decline. But that was impossible. She'd buried him 6 months ago. "Sarah girl," his voice carried across the water as clearly as if he were standing next to her. "Time you knew the truth about this place." Sarah's rational mind screamed that she was hallucinating, that the stress and the storm were making her see things that couldn't be there. But her heart knew better. Her grandfather had always been connected to this land in ways she couldn't understand, had always seemed to know things about the animals and the weather that he couldn't possibly know. "The barn?" she called back. "What's happening to the barn?" "It's remembering," he replied, stepping into the water that should have been rushing around his legs but instead seemed to part for him. "This land's been sacred for longer than you know. The creek used to run right through here, fed a natural pool where the Cherokee came to heal their horses. When I built the barn, I thought I was just building on high ground. Didn't realize I was building on holy ground." Thunder surfaced near Sarah's perch, and she reached out instinctively to touch his muzzle. The horse's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw intelligence and gratitude that went far beyond anything she'd ever witnessed in an animal. He was trying to tell her something. "They know," her grandfather continued, now close enough that she could see the smile lines around his eyes. "Animals always know. That's why I brought them here, Sarah. They needed healing. In this place, it heals." "But you're dead," Sarah said, the words feeling strange and hollow as they left her mouth. "Death's just another kind of water to cross." He replied with the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used to explain everything from weather patterns to why certain horses trusted certain people. "And some crossings, you get to come back from." The water was still rising, but Sarah no longer cared about the practical implications. Her entire worldview was reshaping itself around what she was witnessing. The horses continued to swim and play, their movements creating ripples that caught the storm's light like liquid silver. "Is this real?" she asked. "Real as anything," her grandfather said, now standing in water up to his chest but showing no discomfort. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Sarah could ask what he meant, a new sound cut through the storm car engines and shouting voices. Headlights swept across the flooded property, and she could see emergency vehicles making their way up the hill toward her farmhouse. "They'll want to evacuate you," her grandfather said. "Want to condemn the property? Probably. Call this a disaster zone." Sarah looked back at her horses, still swimming in the impossible pool her barn had become. Thunder had found a way to climb onto one of the floating hay bales, and was standing there like some mythical creature from a fairy tale, water streaming from his coat in rivulets that seemed to glow with their own light. "They won't understand," she said. "No," her grandfather agreed. The morning sun revealed the impossible scope of what had happened overnight. The floodwater had receded everywhere except inside the barn, where it remained crystal clear and luminous, as if the structure itself was holding on to something precious. Sarah sat on the farmhouse porch, wrapping her hands around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the parade of officials who'd arrived with the dawn. County emergency management, insurance adjusters, a structural engineer who kept shaking his head and taking measurements that didn't seem to make sense, a representative from the Department of Natural Resources who'd been on his phone for the past hour, speaking in increasingly agitated tones. Thunder, Misty, and Dakota grazed peacefully in the upper pasture, looking remarkably ordinary in the morning light. But Sarah could see the difference in them, the way Thunder moved without his usual stiffness, how Misty approached the fence line instead of shying away from strangers, the alertness in Dakota's eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. Ms. McKinnon. Sarah looked up to see a woman in a crisp blue suit approaching. She was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe late 30s, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she was used to being the smartest person in the room. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez from the state's Department of Environmental Protection. I need to ask you some questions about what happened here last night." "Coffee's inside if you want some," Sarah offered, not moving from her chair. "Thank you, but I'd prefer to get straight to business." Dr. Vasquez consulted a tablet. "According to the emergency responders who arrived last night, you refused evacuation and claimed your barn had become a miraculous pool. Can you elaborate on that?" Sarah studied the woman's face, looking for any sign of openness or curiosity. She found only professional skepticism. "You've seen the barn. What's your explanation for why the water didn't drain out?" "There are several possibilities. Structural collapse could have created a dam effect. The flooding may have deposited sediment that's temporarily sealing gaps in the foundation. Or Dr. Vasquez paused, consulting her tablet again. The reports from last night may have been exaggerated due to the traumatic nature of the event. You think I imagined it? I think people under extreme stress sometimes perceive things differently than they actually occurred. From the barn, Sarah could hear the soft splash of water lapping against wood. The sound had been constant since the flood receded, as if something was still moving in there. The officials had been too focused on taking measurements and photos to notice, but Sarah heard it. Dr. Vasquez, she said carefully, have you looked inside the barn yet? I've reviewed the preliminary structural assessment. The water appears to be approximately 6 feet deep, which is concerning from a safety standpoint but not necessarily. Have you looked inside? Sarah repeated. The woman's professional composure flickered slightly. I was planning to do a full inspection this afternoon, once we have the proper safety equipment. Sarah stood up, setting down her cold coffee. Come with me now. Ms. McKinnon, I don't think that's advisable without bringing your tablet, Sarah interrupted, already walking toward the barn. Document everything. Take all the measurements you want, but look first. Dr. Vasquez hesitated, then followed, her heels squelching in the mud. As they approached the barn, the splashing sounds became more distinct. Not random lapping, but rhythmic, purposeful movement. Is there something in the water? Dr. Vasquez asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. See for yourself. Sarah pulled open the barn door, and Dr. Vasquez gasped. The water was indeed about 6 feet deep, but it was so clear they could see every detail of the barn floor beneath. Stranger still, the water seemed to generate its own light. A soft blue-green luminescence that had nothing to do with the sunlight streaming through the door, but what made Dr. Vasquez drop her tablet was what was swimming in the water. Fish. Dozens of them. Species that shouldn't exist in floodwater. Gliding through the submerged barn with the same ethereal grace Sarah had witnessed in her horses. She recognized rainbow trout, their colors impossibly vivid, bass that seemed to shimmer with internal light, and others she couldn't identify, fish that looked ancient, primitive, as if they'd swum here from some primordial lake. This is impossible, Dr. Vasquez whispered. Floodwater is contaminated, oxygen depleted, nothing could survive in it, certainly nothing could thrive. But they are thriving, Sarah pointed out. Look at them. The fish moved in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, weaving between the submerged support beams and spirals and figure eights. As Sarah and Dr. Vasquez watched, a massive trout surfaced near the barn center, its scales catching the strange light like jewels. The water quality readings we took this morning, Dr. Vasquez said, more to herself than to Sarah. They couldn't be right. pH perfect. Dissolved oxygen levels higher than most natural springs. No contamination markers at all. Maybe your instruments are working fine, Sarah suggested. Maybe this water isn't what you think it is. Dr. Vasquez retrieved her dropped tablet with shaking hands. I need to call the university. Get a marine biologist out here, maybe a hydrologist. This could be some kind of underground spring that was activated by the flood pressure. Could be, Sarah agreed, though she knew it was something far more extraordinary than that. Question is, what are you going to recommend? That the state drain it? Fill it in? Condemn the property? The question hit Dr. Vasquez like a physical blow. Sarah could see the conflict playing out across her face. The scientist fascinated by an impossible phenomenon. The bureaucrat concerned about liability and protocol. I need to document everything. Run more tests. The environmental impact alone. The environmental impact is that everything in and around that water is healing, Sarah said firmly. My horses haven't looked this healthy in years. You see those fish? They're not just surviving, they're flourishing. What if instead of destroying it, we protected it? Before Dr. Vasquez could respond, voices approached from outside. Sarah recognized the booming tone of County Commissioner Dale Brennan, a man who'd been trying to buy her property for development for the past decade. Complete disaster, of course. Property's uninhabitable now, clearly. Best thing would be to condemn it, let the county take it over for flood management purposes. Sarah stepped outside to find Commissioner Brennan talking to a small group that included the structural engineer, 2 men in expensive suits she didn't recognize, and a woman with a camera who was obviously from the local news. Commissioner, Sarah called out. Enjoying the tour of my property, Brennan had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Sarah, good to see you're safe. We're just discussing the best way to handle this situation. One of the men in suits stepped forward. Ms. McKinnon, I'm Richard Holloway from Holloway Development. Commissioner Brennan has explained the unfortunate circumstances. We'd like to make you an offer that would help you relocate somewhere safer while allowing us to properly remediate this flood-damaged area. Sarah felt her temper flare. Remediate. The water's cleaner than what comes out of most people's taps. Ma'am, with respect, floodwater is inherently contaminated, the structural engineer interjected. The standing water in your barn poses significant health risks. We're recommending immediate drainage and structural assessment for safety reasons. Have any of you actually looked at the water? Sarah asked. The group exchanged glances. We've taken preliminary readings, the engineer said. But without proper safety precautions, Dr. Vasquez just examined it, Sarah interrupted. Tell them what you found. All eyes turned to the environmental scientist, who was still clutching her tablet. Sarah could see the moment of decision in her eyes: career safety versus scientific integrity. The preliminary findings are unusual, Dr. Vasquez said carefully. The water quality is remarkably high, unusually high. I'm recommending a full ecological assessment before any remediation efforts. Commissioner Brennan frowned. Alina, we can't leave standing water on private property indefinitely. The liability issues alone are outweighed by the potential scientific discovery, she finished firmly. Dr. Vasquez was gaining confidence as she spoke. This could be a unique hydrological phenomenon. We need to understand it before we destroy it. I agree, Sarah said, which is why I'm not accepting any offers to sell, and I'm not agreeing to any drainage or remediation. Richard Holloway's friendly mask slipped slightly. Ms. McKinnon, I don't think you understand the financial implications of what you're facing. Insurance won't cover flood damage of this magnitude. The cost of proper cleanup and restoration will be enormous. We're offering to take that burden off your hands. For how much? Sarah asked, curious despite herself. Considering the circumstances, we could offer $200,000 for the full 50 acres. Sarah almost laughed. The property had been appraised at over $500,000 just 2 years ago, and that was before the development boom had made farmland in the area even more valuable. That's generous, considering it's worthless in its current state, Commissioner Brennan added quickly. Or, Sarah said slowly, it's invaluable in its current state, and you know it. The news reporter, who'd been quietly filming the exchange, stepped forward. Ms. McKinnon, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7. Can you tell our viewers what you think? They came from everywhere, escaped from neighboring farms, slipped away from boarding stables, even a few that looked like they'd broken out of trailer transport. Each one arrived with the same purposeful calm thunder had shown during the storm, as if following an ancient call that only they could hear. Sarah stood at her kitchen window at dawn, watching a magnificent Appaloosa mare lead her foal down the hillside toward the barn. The sight should have filled her with wonder, but all she felt was growing dread. Word was spreading. Her phone had been ringing nonstop since yesterday's news broadcast. Veterinarians wanting to examine the horses, reporters from 3 states away, a documentary filmmaker from California, someone claiming to represent a pharmaceutical company interested in studying the healing properties of the water. Most disturbing of all had been the call from a Dr. Marcus Webb at the Centers for Disease Control, asking pointed questions about whether she'd noticed any unusual biological activity on her property. Sarah hadn't answered that one. A knock at her front door interrupted her brooding. Through the window, she saw Dr. Vasquez standing on the porch, but she wasn't alone. A tall man in jeans and a flannel shirt stood beside her, someone Sarah didn't recognize. Sarah, Dr. Vasquez said. When she opened the door, this is Dr. James Hawthorne. He's a veterinary researcher from the State University. Dr. Hawthorne stepped forward with an eager smile. Ms. McKinnon, I can't tell you how excited I am to be here. Elena's preliminary reports are absolutely fascinating. I thought our agreement was that you'd conduct your study quietly, Sarah said to Dr. Vasquez. It was, but the situation has changed. James specializes in equine behavior and physiology. When horses started congregating here from across the county, I realized we needed his expertise. Sarah looked past them to the barn, where she could see several horses standing belly-deep in the glowing water. A paint horse she'd never seen before was actually floating on his back, something that should have been physically impossible. How many people know? She asked. Dr. Hawthorne consulted a tablet. Well, the initial environmental report has been filed with the state, basic protocol. But the unusual equine behavioral patterns triggered automatic notifications to several departments: agriculture, natural resources, public health. Public health. Sarah's stomach dropped. Why public health? Large-scale animal behavioral anomalies can sometimes indicate environmental contamination or disease vectors. Dr. Vasquez explained quickly. It's just standard procedure, but it means we're running out of time to study this privately. A new voice cut through the conversation. Which is why you're going to stop studying it at all. Sarah turned to see Commissioner Brennan climbing out of a county SUV, followed by Richard Holloway and 2 men she didn't recognize, one in a suit, one in what looked like military fatigues. Commissioner, Sarah said coldly, this is private property. Not anymore, it isn't. The man in the suit stepped forward, producing an official-looking document. I'm Federal Agent Marcus Chen, EPA Emergency Response Team. As of this morning, this site has been designated as a potential environmental hazard pending investigation. On what grounds? Dr. Vasquez demanded uncontrolled accumulation of unidentified biological agents, potential contamination of groundwater systems, an unauthorized congregation of livestock creating public health risks. Agent Chen recited, all persons and animals need to be evacuated immediately. Sarah felt the world tilting around her. You can't just we can, Richard Holloway said with barely concealed satisfaction. Federal environmental emergency powers are quite broad. Of course, if you were willing to cooperate with a voluntary sale, we might be able to expedite the cleanup process. This is insane, Dr. Hawthorne protested. We're on the verge of a major scientific discovery. These horses are exhibiting healing responses that could revolutionize veterinary medicine. The man in military fatigues spoke for the first time, which is precisely why this needs to be contained. I'm Colonel David Reeves, U.S. Army Medical Research Command. If there's an unknown biological agent causing these effects, it represents a potential security issue. Sarah stared at him. Security issue. Biological weapons research? Ms. McKinnon? Foreign governments would be very interested in any substance that could enhance healing or alter animal behavior. We can't allow that kind of material to remain in civilian hands. It's not a weapon? Sarah said desperately. It's just water. Sacred water. Agent Chen raised an eyebrow. Sacred. Sarah realized her mistake immediately, but it was too late. She'd given them exactly the opening they needed to paint her as an unstable religious fanatic. Ms. McKinnon, Colonel Reeves said in a tone that was probably meant to be reassuring. I understand you've formed an emotional attachment to this phenomenon, but you need to understand the bigger picture. If this water has genuine healing properties, it needs to be studied in a controlled environment where it can benefit all of humanity, not just a few horses. And if it doesn't have healing properties, Agent Chen added, then it's a potential contamination site that needs immediate remediation. Either way, Richard Holloway concluded smoothly, the property needs to be cleared. We're prepared to offer fair market value for contaminated land. Commissioner Brennan interrupted. Given the circumstances, Sarah looked around at the circle of faces, some sympathetic, some coldly calculating, all representing forces far more powerful than one woman with a flooded barn. The legal document in Agent Chen's hand might as well have been a death warrant for everything she was trying to protect. A sharp whinny cut through the tension. Everyone turned toward the barn, where Thunder stood in the doorway, water streaming from his coat. The old horse looked directly at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw her grandfather's stubborn defiance. How long do I have? She asked quietly. Evacuation begins at noon, Agent Chen replied. All animals will be relocated to appropriate facilities for observation and quarantine. Quarantine, Dr. Hawthorne protested. These horses aren't sick there. The opposite of sick, which is why they need to be studied, Colonel Reeves said firmly. In a secure facility where we can understand exactly what's affecting them. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. They were going to take the horses away from the healing water, lock them up in sterile government facilities, and probably dissect the pool inch by inch until they'd destroyed everything that made it special. And if I refuse, then we'll obtain a court order and remove you by force, Agent Chen said matter-of-factly. I'd rather not do that, Ms. McKinnon, but this is a matter of national security now. Dr. Vasquez stepped closer to Sarah. There might be another way, she said quietly. If you were willing to cooperate with a formal scientific study, with proper oversight. Oversight by whom? Sarah asked. By us, Colonel Reeves answered. The research would be conducted jointly by the Army Medical Research Command and the CDC, with appropriate security protocols. Sarah almost laughed. You want me to help you turn this into a weapons program? We want to understand what we're dealing with, Agent Chen corrected. The healing properties could lead to breakthrough medical treatments. The behavioral modifications could help us develop better therapies for PTSD in service animals. This could benefit millions of people. By destroying the one place where it actually works. By studying it properly so we can replicate it safely, Colonel Reeves said. Ms. McKinnon, you're thinking too small. If we can understand the mechanism behind these effects, we could create healing centers across the country. Imagine every veterans hospital having access to this kind of therapy. For a moment, Sarah wavered. The vision he painted was seductive, her grandfather's sacred pool, helping heal people across the nation. But then she remembered the glowing water, the fish that shouldn't exist. Her grandfather's ghostly warning about fighting for what's right. You can't replicate it, she said with sudden certainty. That's what scares you, isn't it? You can't control it, so you want to destroy it. The silence that followed told her she'd hit close to the mark. Ms. McKinnon, Agent Chen said carefully, I think you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. We're offering you a chance to be part of something that could change the world. The world doesn't need changing, Sarah replied. It needs healing, and some things can't be mass-produced in laboratories. She turned and walked toward the barn, knowing they would follow but not caring. The horses in the water looked up as she approached, not just her original 3, but all 27 of them, representing breeds and ages and conditions that spanned the spectrum of equine suffering. Some bore old injuries that had visibly healed. Others showed the mental trauma of abuse that was slowly fading from their eyes. Thunder approached the edge of the pool, and Sarah knelt to meet him. As she touched his muzzle, she felt something pass between them, not words, but understanding. The old horse was trying to tell her something important. They're not just healing, she said aloud, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. They're remembering what? Dr. Hawthorne asked, genuinely curious despite the circumstances. Sarah looked up at the assembled officials. seeing them clearly for the first time. They were all so focused on what they could take from the convoy stretched for nearly a mile down the county road. Horse trailers, pickup trucks, RVs, even a few cars with makeshift travel cages strapped to their roofs carrying smaller animals. Sarah counted over 200 vehicles before she stopped trying to keep track. What the hell is this? Agent Chen demanded, speaking rapidly into his radio. I need immediate backup at the McKinnon property. We have an uncontrolled civilian gathering. But Sarah was watching the faces of the people climbing out of their vehicles, and she saw something that made her heart swell with unexpected hope. These weren't curiosity seekers or protesters. These were people carrying animal scats in carriers, dogs on leashes, even a woman cradling what looked like an injured hawk. All of them moving toward the barn with the same purposeful calm the horses had shown. They're bringing their animals, Dr. Hawthorne said in wonder. They're all bringing animals that need healing. An elderly man in overalls approached the group of officials, carrying a small dog that was clearly in the final stages of some wasting disease. Excuse me, he said politely, is this where the healing water is? My granddaughter saw something on the news. Before anyone could answer, a woman joined them, leading a 3-legged German shepherd. I drove 6 hours from Tennessee, she said. My dog lost his leg in Afghanistan. He was a military working dog. The vet said there was nothing more they could do for his arthritis. But when I saw that news report, more people were arriving, every moment, creating a growing crowd around the barn. Sarah saw Colonel Reeves speaking urgently into his own radio, probably calling for military backup. Commissioner Brennan was red-faced and shouting into his phone about controlling the situation. But the situation was already beyond anyone's control. A young woman approached Sarah directly, tears streaming down her face as she carried a limp. Kitten, please, she said. I know this sounds crazy, but I had to try. She's dying, and the emergency vet said there's nothing they can do. When I saw the horses on TV, Sarah looked at the dying kitten, then at the growing crowd of desperate pet owners, then at the officials who were clearly preparing to use force to clear the property. The choice her grandfather had told her to make suddenly became crystal clear. Bring her to the water, Sarah said. Ma'am, you can't, Agent Chen started, but Sarah cut him off. This is still my property until your paperwork goes through, she said firmly, and these people have a right to try. She led the way toward the barn, and the crowd followed despite Agent Chen's shouted protests. Inside, the horses were still swimming in the luminous pool, but they moved aside as if making room for others. The young woman knelt at the water's edge and gently lowered the kitten into the glowing liquid. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the kitten's eyes opened, and it began to paddle weakly but determinedly toward the center of the pool. A collective gasp arose from the crowd, as the small animal's movements grew stronger. By the time it reached the middle of the pool, the kitten was swimming with obvious enjoyment, its coat glistening in the strange light. This is impossible, Dr. Hawthorne whispered, but he was already taking notes. His scientific skepticism, warring with what he was witnessing. The elderly man with the dying dog stepped forward next. May I? Sarah nodded, and he waded into the pool with his pet. The dog, which had been barely breathing, immediately lifted its head and began to paddle. Within minutes, it was playing like a puppy, its wasted frame filling out as they watched. Word of what was happening spread through the crowd like wildfire. People began forming an orderly line, each carrying an animal that had brought them here. Sarah found herself acting as an unofficial coordinator, helping elderly owners into the water, supporting scared animals as they encountered the healing liquid for the first time. This has to stop, Colonel Reeves declared, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah noticed he was watching a military working dog, probably his own, transform from a scarred, trauma-damaged animal into something joyful and whole. Why? Asked Dr. Vasquez, who was documenting everything with obvious excitement. Look at what's happening here. This isn't just healing, it's miraculous. Miraculous things don't exist in nature, Agent Chen said, but even he seemed shaken by what he was witnessing. There has to be a scientific explanation. Maybe there is, Dr. Hawthorne said slowly. Maybe we just don't have the science to understand it yet. The crowd was growing by the hour. News helicopters circled overhead. Sarah could see reporters setting up equipment along the property line, broadcasting live feeds of the unprecedented gathering. Social media was undoubtedly exploding with videos and photos of animals being healed in ways that defied explanation. But it was the people that touched Sarah most deeply. She watched a Vietnam veteran wade into the pool with his service dog, tears streaming down his face as the animal's PTSD symptoms visibly melted away. A little girl brought her pet rabbit, which had been paralyzed in an accident, and squealed with delight as it began to hop normally again. An old woman carried in a parrot that had been plucking its feathers in grief after its mate died, and watched in wonder as the bird began to sing again. Sarah? The voice was familiar, and Sarah turned to see Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the veterinarian who had been treating Thunder before his transformation. The older woman looked stunned as she watched the old horse playing in the water like a colt. Dr. Morgan, I can explain. Don't, the vet interrupted. I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Thunder's arthritis was so advanced I was going to recommend putting him down next month. Now look at him. They both watched as Thunder dove beneath the surface and came up shaking water from his mane, whinnying with pure joy. The question is, Dr. Morgan continued, what are you going to do when they try to shut this down? Before Sarah could answer, a new commotion erupted near the barn. Entrance. Agent Chen was arguing with someone Sarah couldn't see through the crowd, but his voice was getting increasingly agitated. Ma'am, you don't understand the security implications. I understand them perfectly. The voice that answered was crisp, authoritative, and female, which is why I'm ordering you to stand down. The crowd parted to reveal a woman in an army-dress uniform with general's stars on her shoulders. She was perhaps 60 years old, silver-haired with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. General Martinez, Colonel, Reeves said, snapping to attention. I wasn't expecting, obviously not, Colonel, or you wouldn't have created this cluster. General Martinez surveyed the scene, hundreds of people and animals in and around the glowing pool. News helicopters overhead, social media turning the event into a global phenomenon. Do you have any idea what kind of PR nightmare you've just handed our enemies? Ma'am, the security protocols for unknown biological agents clearly state that we're supposed to contain situations quietly, not turn them into international incidents. General Martinez finished. Thanks to your heavy-handed approach, this story is trending worldwide. #MiraclePool is the #1 hashtag on 3 continents. Sarah felt a spark of hope. Maybe the global attention would protect the pool from government seizure, but General Martinez's next words crushed that hope, which is why we need to end this now, before it gets any more out of hand. Agent Chen, begin clearing the civilians. Immediately. General Dr. Vasquez stepped forward boldly. I strongly advise against any precipitous action. We're witnessing phenomena that could revolutionize our understanding of biology, medicine, even physics. To destroy it without proper study would be scientific vandalism. Dr. Vasquez, I appreciate your scientific enthusiasm, but this is now a matter of national security. We cannot allow an uncontrolled healing agent to remain in civilian hands. Uncontrolled? Sarah found her voice at last. General, look around you. Does this look uncontrolled to you? Indeed, despite the hundreds of people and animals present, the scene was remarkably peaceful. People waited patiently in line, helped each other with their animals, shared food and water they'd brought for the journey. Children played safely at the water's edge while elderly people rested in folding chairs, watching their beloved pets experience impossible healing. Ms. McKinnon, General Martinez said, her tone softening slightly, I can see you care deeply about these animals, but you need to understand what you're dealing with. If foreign governments get their hands on this water, then they'll help heal their animals too, Sarah interrupted. How is that a threat? Because healing can be weaponized. Colonel Reeves interjected. Enhanced soldier recovery, biological warfare applications, mind control through neurochemical manipulation, mind control. Dr. Hawthorne laughed incredulously. Colonel, these animals aren't being controlled. They're being freed. Freed from pain, from trauma, from the damage we humans have inflicted on them. A new voice joined the conversation, the young woman whose kitten had been the first to enter the water. My cat isn't being controlled. She's just herself again. The way she was before she got sick. That's exactly right, said the Vietnam veteran, his service dog now calmly sitting beside him, no longer showing any signs of the hype that had marked its PTSD. These animals aren't being changed. They're being restored. General Martinez looked around at the crowd, and Sarah,